Okay, ladies, gentlemen, and hackers all around, I am very excited for our presentation today. Thank you for coming. We appreciate it. I know right after this talk we've got lunch, so I won't keep you over. I know how important food is. Trust me. And I'm sure we're all hungry after long days of talks and whatnot. So today we will be talking about the process that myself and my team went through this last semester. Finding some 0 days in a home router created by the Vilo company. But first, we're going to introduce ourselves. My name is Justin Applegate. I am a current grad student here at Brigham Young University, and I go by the handle Lego Clones.
Yep. My name is Justin Mott. I'm also a grad student at BYU, and I go by the handle Castorberus.
And my name's Ava Petersen. I'm an undergrad student at BYU, and I go by the handle Delta Blue Jay.
The fourth member of our team is Wyatt Pangirl. He graduated this last year, so he was not able to make it with us. He goes by Spouting Whale and was also an integral part of our team. We work in the Cybersecurity Research Lab at BYU under Dr. Albert Tay, and we love CTFs. It is one of our favorite things to do. So for the project, we wanted to apply our skills that we had learned in CTFs to real life by breaking into a router.
Yeah, so we formed a team under our lab, started this project. We decided on this semester-long time frame focusing on the Vilo mesh Wi-Fi system. So,
yeah, I'll take it. So Vilo Living is a pretty new company. They were founded back in 2021, so they've only been around for 2 to 3 years. It had been about 2.5 when we started the project. They only have, as far as I know, 2 products: a Wi-Fi mesh system that uses Wi-Fi 5 and one that uses Wi-Fi 6. We looked online because the first thing you do whenever you're looking for vulnerabilities is you do recon, you do OSINT. Has anyone looked into this before? Have there been CVEs or any sort of technical deep dive published before? We looked. We found nothing. So between the fact that it was new, no one had ever found vulnerabilities as far as we had known, and it was a pretty cheap router, we figured this would be the perfect place, the perfect time, and the perfect opportunity for us to get our feet wet, to start playing around with some of the real-world vulnerabilities and see if we could even find anything. They technically had a bug bounty program. If you go on their website, they say, yes, we have a bug bounty program. You can get swag for it. But you have to sign an NDA. And I was like, okay, interesting. I don't know what the NDA looks like. Let's go ahead and take a look. I applied and said, hey, send me the NDA. They never responded. We didn't hear anything. This is kind of foreshadowing for how things went with them. Not very well. And as an important note, the firmware was not released online. So that leads us into our 3 goals. The first one was to acquire the firmware. We want the software that runs on the hardware so it turns from a black box test into a white box test. Secondly, we wanted to pop a shell on the actual device. That helps with debugging, that helps us pull out updated firmware more easily. It just helps in so many areas. And then the last thing, our most important goal was to find as many pre-authentication, remote code execution vulnerabilities as we can. The threat model for this is you invite someone over to your house, you give them the Wi-Fi password, they have access to your LAN. Can they take over your router just by having access to that LAN without having to know any admin password or anything like that?
yeah, so we started just poking at it. We took the device apart. This is the board that we ended up with inside. We found some UART pins. We tried to solder. They were just kind of UART port holes in the board on the first one we opened. We tried to solder it, and that bricked the first router that we killed. The second one we opened had pins there, so that was a lot easier. So we connected up to UART. We got some boot info and a Linux logging in screen. We didn't know the root password, and the UART interface died after 30 seconds, and it was so convenient to print how many seconds you had every second you had left. It wasn't any of the easy logins, so we had no free shell here.
I also want to point out on the bottom, you'll notice there is a link to a GitHub repo. We will have a QR code at the end with that also, but if you want to follow along, if you want to see the research, some of the more details about what we did, you can go ahead and follow there.
So we moved on to the mobile app. So unlike a lot of routers, there was no web interface on this. So you couldn't go to like 192.168.01 or whatever and get the like management interface. You had to go through this app. So we got it off of Google Play, loaded up into some reverse engineering tools, and started going through it. Apparently, my team members think that mobile reverse engineering sucks. I thought it was a fantastic time. We found some leftover stuff that seemed inactive, and it was a pretty big app. But the big thing that we discovered was there was a custom service on port 5432. And so we worked on reverse engineering that protocol to figure out how this app was talking to the router of the LAN. So this is kind of the overview of how it went. There was this phone signature at the first few bytes, and then an opcode to tell them kind of what was going on with the rest of the message, a null, and then sometimes a payload, and then 2 nulls. Not all the opcodes had payloads. They were usually encrypted with this weird XXT custom implementation plus some obfuscation. The original key that they would use for this was hard-coded in the app, and then it would send it over to the router, which would like use it to encrypt another key and send it back and forth. But because the original key was just in plain text in the app, it was pretty easy to write our own Python class so that we could communicate over the protocol ourselves. But we still had no firmware. So we went to attempting to get the stuff off of the external flash memory. We tried some software solutions, which didn't really help. So we did some research and purchased this Salier logic analyzer, which all of a sudden made our lives completely easy. What we had just spent the last like month to 2 months trying to figure out how to get off took us about 30 seconds to get the SPI data off of it, and then reading the info sheet for the processor, we wrote some Python, decoded the SPI protocol, and then we had all of the firmware in binary. So that's kind of what the logic data looked like coming off of in the Salier server or Salier software.
Okay, so at this point, we had recovered the firmware. We accomplished goal number 1. It's now a white box test. We have access to it. So the next thing that we decided to focus on was emulating the environment and compiling stuff to run on the actual device. So this device used 32-bit little endian MIPS processor, and it used UC-libc as its libc implementation. Most Linux systems nowadays use glibc, some use musl. This uses UC-libc. This was pretty new for us. But we had extracted the firmware, we identified which specific binary ran that port 5432 service, we started looking at it, and we used QEMU in order to emulate it. So what QEMU does is, it is software that implements what the hardware would do, and it allows you to run like executables for other architectures on your architecture. So we downloaded QEMU for MIPS, statically compiled, and then we used chroot in order to change what the root directory looked like. That way, when the executables that were written in MIPS were looking for library files at a hard-coded path, they could actually find them there, and it was successfully running. We use what is known as build root to create a UC-libc ng toolchain. Now, you'll notice UC-libc is different than UC-libc ng. UC-libc was actually discontinued back in 2012. Some guy said, hey, I still want to use this. They created a fork of it, still maintain it, and that's UC-libc ng. So we use that toolchain. So it is a little different than what they have actually on the router. We created a bind shell that we use later on, and we'll talk about that, and that worked just fine. We also tried to compile GDB server and put it on the device, and we put it on there, and it would run, but whenever we connected to it with our own GDB, it just kept segfaulting. So I don't know if that was some issue with the compilation, differing versions or whatnot, but we had some issues with that. In order to emulate it, it looks something like this. You open up one terminal and you do chroot QEMU, and you'll notice the -G1234 at the top. If you're not familiar with QEMU, what this means is we're going to open a remote debugging session, open a second terminal, use GDB, connect to that remote debug session, place some specific breakpoints, in order to actually spin up the service and skip past a bunch of the assembly code that we don't want to run or have to worry about. And then because this opens up a network service, you have to open up a third terminal to actually interact with the network service. So we had 3 open at the same time, but that allowed us to run through, watch, and debug some of the memory corruption vulnerabilities that we had found. So we spent about a month and a half searching for vulnerabilities. It took us the first 2 months or so to enumerate and finally get the firmware. So we spent a solid 5 to 6 weeks looking for bugs. We found 9 vulnerabilities, 6 of which are critical, 3 were medium. Out of those 6 critical, 4 of them were pre-authentication buffer overflows, which was our goal, which that's what we'd wanted to find. We were only able to exploit 1 of them because of stat canaries. Kind of interesting. We found some other bugs while we were trying to weaponize a couple of the other ones. And that's how we found the authenticated command injection that Ava will talk about. But I want to note that pretty much all of the bugs that we found were in this service, this network service running on port 5432. This is the list of vulnerabilities. There's the GitHub link at the bottom where we detail it more specifically. We have reserved CVE numbers for that. We sent in requests earlier this week to have it published. They said it should be published, so I haven't checked on it, but hopefully you can actually just look up the CVE number and then it should have a link to our GitHub repo also. We're gonna go over just 3 of those vulnerabilities. The first one is the fact that this custom service that ran on the router had no authentication. It used a symmetric algorithm, XXT, using hard-coded keys that you could recover from either the firmware or in the app, which means anyone that is on your LAN, if you have a Vilo router, as long as they know how to speak that protocol and they have that key, they can communicate with it. That means that they can change your SSID, they can change your password, they can reboot your router, they can look at and change your PPPoE username and password and a bunch of other stuff. That additionally allows them to exploit all the other vulnerabilities that we had found on there. That is what turned those buffer overflows from authenticated to unauthenticated. So kind of a big problem, a big issue there.
Another important thing to note is that while most of as on the previous slide, the first point says that most of the time the router communication would go from app to AWS to router, and this was just for setup, except for the fact that this service stayed on after setup and forever. So it was always available no matter what the state the router was in.
The second vulnerability I want to go over is the first buffer overflow that we found. It was in the local app set router token function. That's a mouthful. It used the hex 3E opcode, and the app would send a token and a time zone in a JSON object that was encrypted. The router would receive this, decrypt it, and then parse this JSON object, and it runs scanf. Now, if you're familiar with C code and memory corruption vulnerabilities, you'll pretty quickly notice this takes the entire token and puts it into the token buffer, but it never checks the size of the string that it's placing in there. So the token buffer has a fixed size. Let's say, for example, 20 bytes. If I send t equals and then 30 A's, it's going to copy a buffer of 30 into one of size 20. That leads to memory corruption. So we were like, this is awesome. How can we actually exploit it? First, you want to look at the mitigations. What is actually present? We had seen Pi and canaries were disabled for the version of the firmware that we were looking at. And so if you've done some binary exploitation or exploit development, the first thing that comes to mind is ROP. The stack was not executable, so we had to use ROP. But the thing is, ROP is actually really, really difficult in MIPS because MIPS does not have a return instruction. It implements the same functionality in a kind of roundabout way, but it makes it significantly more difficult. Also, as a plug, BYU CTF, which we put on in about May of every year, I created a MIPS Pwn CTF challenge to exploit a vulnerability similar to the one that I'm describing to you right now. If you really want a challenge, go ahead and try it out. I'd recommend it. Okay, so how are we actually going to exploit this? So I found a gadget somewhere that would run system, and it would take the address stored in the S8 register, add hex 28 bytes to that, and then run that. And during the overflow, the RA or return address and S8 registers were overwritten, which means if I could overwrite RA with the address of this gadget and then overwrite S8 to point to a specific place in memory that we control, we now have a user-controlled bash command. The problem is ASLR is enabled. We didn't know stack values. So then we thought, well, we can control global variables. So let's find some global variables that we can manipulate. The name of the router that you set in the app is one of the global variables. So we were like, this is awesome. Let's go ahead and try this, see if we can actually exploit it. And I do want to note, we found later on that what we thought was the latest firmware version was actually an earlier version, and the latest one, which was actually running on the router, had canaries, so it didn't even work anyway. But in the meantime, because we're very, very smart, we did semicolon, reboot, semicolon. We set that as the router name, and then we ran the exploit, nothing happened. So we were like, I hope we didn't mess anything up. And so we restarted the router to make sure to flush anything out, and the router never came back online. So that was the death of router number 2. And we wanted to figure out what the heck was going on. We found another bug.
So since after we found this weird command injection bug, we're like, well, why is it doing this? So we went back into the code and tried to find what was happening. So we ended up finding this code in the sysconf binary, which is run upon boot of the router. And so you can see that it formats a udhcpc command with several variables, including the router hostname, which is what we can control in the app, and it pipes that directly into the system function. And so because we control the router name, we can just do semicolon, whatever bash command we want, semicolon, and it will run it. And so we're actually able to verify this by looking at the boot output that's sent over the UART interface. And you can see that it actually runs the command. And this was originally DEFCON talk. That's why it says DEFCON. So there are a couple caveats, though, with this exploit, including that the injected command is run only on boot, since that's when the sysconf binary is run, as well as the router name is limited to a length of 30 characters in the app. So as a result, we had to write our payload so that it would gradually write a longer script into a writable directory that was persistent, which ended up being the /huale directory, so that we could gradually write a longer script and then at the end run it to then do some more things.
This was a pretty painstaking process because you had to set the router name and then reboot it. And because it's an old dinky router or whatever, it takes a minute or two. And so we had to do this 12 times. So it took us 30 minutes to actually set this up. And the worst part was when we were still trying to figure out how to do it right, we would mess something up, had to start all the way over again. Got to, recreate whatever this huale/b script is in order to do it again. So it was really annoying. But then once you had it up, every time you rebooted it, it would run this command, pull the commands down and run it.
Yeah, and another caveat was that the network wasn't actually set up at the time of running the ejected commands. We had to figure out how to make it asynchronously wait for a little bit until the network came up, so then we could run our next script, which, as described here, the gradual script that we wrote then downloads and runs a longer script from the internet, which is why we had to have the network. And so that second script itself then downloads and runs a compiled cbind shell, which will allow us to netcat into the router, which gave us our first actual shell on the router. And so you can see here, we're able to netcat in and find that we have gained a shell as the root user.
You'll notice, thank you. Embedded devices are interesting because they're very, very lightweight. This didn't even have the who am I command on it. We tried to run that the first time and got nothing, and we were like, oh no, our whatever broke, and then we ran ls and then it printed out, and we were like, I guess I just don't have who am I. So echo user, I guess. That's the new way to do it. Okay, so at this point, we had reached the end of our time. We had found a couple of vulnerabilities. We wanted to get in touch with the vendor, report them, make sure that they're covered. It was an absolute pain to get in contact with them. They had a terms and conditions page online. They had an email listed there. We emailed it. It came back. Doesn't actually exist. We guessed a couple of other names, support, admin, etc. Also didn't, nothing. We got nothing from them. They have a social media presence. They have a YouTube channel. It's actually kind of funny. You should probably look at it. They have a Facebook page and whatnot. We had tried to join these, send out messages. We got nothing. We filed a support ticket and finally got a response saying, thank you for giving this to us. We'll go ahead and have a look. We'll let you know what happens. This is kind of the timeline. So we started the project in January. We finished and reached out to them in early April, reached out again later that week, and we finally heard back from them after 1 month. This is kind of a funny story. A couple of days ago, they posted our DEF CON talk, And one of the people that worked for Vilo saw it, found it, reached out to us, and has been talking with us. And he said, we got your messages from the very, very beginning. And like as a part of the Vilo team, they're like a subsidiary of another big company. And they were like, we don't actually do the dev work. The big company does the dev work. And they had like done a bunch of budget cuts and wage cuts and whatnot. And so we were really hoping, this vulnerability would spur the dev team on the bigger subsidiary side or whatever to actually like work on it, improve it, push out some new updates because nothing had really happened for a couple of months. So they forwarded this on to the dev team, and the dev team responded and said, this is a joke. The OS is clean. All bugs will be cleaned upon reboot, end quote. That's what they said. And it wasn't until our third contact when we said, we are going to disclose this publicly in 90 days if we don't hear from you. That's when they were like, okay, fine, we actually have to listen to this and do something about that. So it's kind of cool to see that this responsible disclosure process that you hear about online actually worked. That if we hadn't said, we will disclose this publicly, you would still have thousands of people out there vulnerable to some of these, if I can say, fairly easy vulnerabilities to find. I mean, we're only a couple of college students in a couple of months. So it was pretty cool to see that actually spurred them into action. We followed up with them a month later, didn't hear anything. Followed up 2 weeks later. We requested CVE numbers that we had told them we would. And then we finally followed up 2 weeks later, and they reached out and said, okay, we have a firmware update. They pushed it to us. And then the 90-day disclosure deadline was August 8th. That was 3 days before our DEF CON talk. We went ahead and published everything. So you can see CVE numbers, you can see the GitHub repo and everything for that. So that was the vendor disclosure process. What are some takeaways from this whole process? We were surprised with how long it took us to actually initially hack it, get that root shell and firmware. We thought it would be a lot quicker, but it took us quite a long time, and we were frustrated for a couple of weeks. But we finally got it, and we started looking for bugs. And as we did expect, it was actually very, very easy to find bugs. In fact, we've only traversed a small percentage of the total attack surface there. If you look through the GitHub repo in depth, you'll realize that there's a lot of documentation that's missing because we didn't have time to do it within the semester that we did the project. So if you are interested and you want to find some vulnerabilities, I promise you there's more out there. So you can piggyback on the research that we've done. There's a lot that is unexplored. Go ahead and look for it. And as we have hacked other Soho, IoT, and embedded devices since then, we found that for a lot of, especially the cheaper ones, this is very, very common. You first initially get the firmware, and they make it difficult because they know it's insecure, but once you get that, it's kind of easy money from that point. So thank you for coming to our talk. This QR code is the link to our GitHub repo. I promise it's not a Rickroll, but if it was, that'd be funny. And then we also have our LinkedIns over here if you'd like to connect to us. I know it is now noon, so we're going to go ahead and close it. We should be around here for the next little bit if you have questions, but thank you for coming.
It was the transmission. Yeah.